In the remote valleys of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like ghostly fingers, certain family names have been whispered for generations. Names spoken only in hushed tones, always accompanied by a glance over the shoulder, always followed by the sign of the cross. The Collins name is one such whisper, a bloodline that carved its legacy not just into the hardwood forests of eastern Kentucky, but into the very fabric of supernatural dread that still haunts these mountains today. What you're about to discover isn't found in any official historical record. The Collins family story has been deliberately buried, their documents sealed, their descendants scattered to the winds. But in the deepest hollows, where cell towers can't reach and GPS signals fail, the old-timers still remember. They remember the strange lights that danced above Collins Ridge on moonless nights. They remember livestock found drained of blood in perfect circles around Collins' property. Most of all, they remember the children who went missing whenever the Collins clan needed something the mountain couldn't provide. The Collins bloodline stretches back to 1847, when Ezekiel Collins first settled in what locals now call the Whispering Valley. He arrived alone, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and an unnatural knowledge of where to dig for water in the driest season anyone could remember. Within months, Collins' land produced crops that thrived while neighboring farms withered. His cattle grew fat on grass that stayed green through the harshest winters. Ezekiel himself seemed untouched by age, his hair remaining coal black and his back staying straight, even as men half his age bent under the weight of mountain life. But prosperity in Appalachia always comes with a price, and the Collins family paid theirs in ways that would make hardened mountain folk cross themselves and hurry past their property after sunset. The first sign that something unnatural protected Collins' fortune came during the harsh winter of 1851. 3 separate families had approached Ezekiel for help, their children starving and their food stores empty. Each family that received Collins' charity reported the same disturbing occurrence within days of accepting his aid. Their youngest child would begin speaking in their sleep, not the innocent murmuring of childhood dreams, but full conversations in voices that didn't belong to them. Voices of people who had died decades before these children were born. Sarah McKinnon, whose family had gratefully accepted Collins' grain during that terrible winter, wrote in her journal about her 4-year-old son, Thomas. The boy began reciting detailed memories of the Civil War battles, describing the scent of gunpowder and the screams of dying horses with a precision that chilled her blood. Thomas had never left their remote hollow, never heard war stories, yet he spoke of Gettysburg as if he had walked among the corpses himself. When Sarah confronted Ezekiel about this strange coincidence, he smiled with teeth that seemed too sharp and told her that some gifts required an exchange of memories. Her boy would carry the experiences of others, he explained, so that those who had passed could continue to serve the Collins family from beyond the grave. The children who accepted Collins' help didn't just gain strange memories. They developed an uncanny ability to find things that were lost, to predict when storms would strike, and most disturbing of all, to sense when death was approaching. Local midwives whispered that Collins-touched children could look at pregnant women and predict which babies wouldn't survive their first winter. These abilities made them valuable to their struggling families, but the price became apparent as they aged. Every child who had received Collins' charity died before their 20th birthday, always during the autumn harvest, always found in the woods with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. By 1863, the Collins family had expanded beyond just Ezekiel. His three sons, Matthias, Jeremiah, and Caleb, had married local women and established their own homesteads throughout the valley. But these weren't ordinary mountain families. The Collins men shared their father's unnatural longevity and his ability to make the land produce beyond all reasonable expectation. More troubling, they shared his hunger for what he called the necessary exchanges. While other mountain families struggled through the Civil War, dealing with raiders and supply shortages, the Collins clan seemed to exist in a bubble of prosperity that defied the chaos surrounding them. Confederate deserters who attempted to raid Collins' property were found days later, not killed by bullets or blades, but aged to death. Their bodies appeared decades older than their actual years, their hair white, their skin wrinkled like ancient leather, their eyes clouded with cataracts. Local authorities, what few remained during the war, officially attributed these deaths to exposure and starvation. But the mountain folk knew better. They knew that anyone who threatened Collins' prosperity paid with years of their life, their vitality somehow transferred to maintain the family's unnatural advantage. The most documented incident of Collins' supernatural protection occurred in September 1864, when a unit of Union cavalry arrived in the valley seeking supplies and suspected Confederate sympathizers. Captain William Hartwell, commanding 18 mounted soldiers, established a temporary camp near Collins Ridge with the intention of thoroughly searching the area. Local residents fled deeper into the mountains, but the Collins family remained, greeting the soldiers with an offer of hospitality that should have raised immediate suspicions. Ezekiel invited the entire unit to dinner, claiming his family was loyal to the Union and eager to assist their cause. The soldiers, weary from months of mountain warfare and grateful for a friendly reception, accepted. According to the single survivor's account, Private James Morrison, the dinner began normally enough. The Collins women served fresh venison, vegetables that seemed impossibly fresh for the season, and corn whiskey that tasted sweeter than any the soldiers had encountered. As the evening progressed, however, Morrison noticed disturbing details that his companions seemed oblivious to. The Collins family spoke in unison occasionally, their voices harmonizing in ways that didn't seem intentional. The shadows in the cabin moved independently of the lamplight, stretching and contracting like living things. Most unsettling, when Collins' family members smiled, their teeth appeared to be different colors, as if they had been replaced with teeth from different people entirely. Morrison's account, preserved in military archives that were later classified and buried, describes what happened next. As the soldiers grew drowsy from the whiskey, Ezekiel Collins began speaking in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. He talked about the mountain's hunger, about the old agreements that predated European settlement, about the price that had to be paid for the land to remain fertile and protective. The other Collins family members joined in, their voices creating a harmonic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls themselves. Morrison, who had consumed less whiskey than his companions due to a stomach ailment, retained enough awareness to realize they were in mortal danger. As his fellow soldiers slumped unconscious around the dinner table, he witnessed the Collins family's true nature revealed. Their skin began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of other faces beneath their familiar features. Their eyes reflected light, like nocturnal animals, and their fingernails extended into claw-like appendages that they used to draw precise cuts on the unconscious soldier's arms. The private managed to escape through a rear window, but not before seeing the Collins family collecting the soldier's blood in ornate bowls carved from what appeared to be human skulls. He fled into the forest, hiding until dawn, when he crept back to investigate. The cabin stood empty, with no sign of his 17 companions except for their horses, which were found grazing peacefully in a nearby meadow. The animals showed no signs of distress, but each bore a small brand on their flanks that matched marks Morrison had glimpsed carved into the Collins cabin walls. Military investigators arrived 3 weeks later, but found no evidence of the missing soldiers beyond Morrison's testimony, which his commanding officers dismissed as the delusions of a man traumatized by guerrilla warfare. The Collins family had vanished, their cabin abandoned, their fields already beginning to return to wilderness. Local residents claimed they had seen the family loading wagons and departing in the middle of the night, but no one could agree on which direction they had traveled, or even how many wagons there had been. Morrison's account might have been forgotten entirely, if not for similar incidents that began occurring throughout Appalachia over the following decades. Families with the Collins name appeared in remote valleys across Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina, always arriving with unusual prosperity and always leaving behind communities marked by mysterious disappearances and unnatural phenomena. These families rarely stayed in one location for more than a generation, but their impact on local folklore persisted long after their departure. The pattern was always the same. A Collins family would arrive in an isolated community, often during times of hardship or natural disaster. They would quickly establish themselves as successful farmers or merchants, their prosperity seeming to flow from sources that neighbors couldn't identify. They would offer help to struggling families, always at moments of greatest desperation, always with the understanding that some form of repayment would eventually be required. Children who accepted Collins' charity would develop supernatural abilities but die young. Adults who dealt extensively with the family would age prematurely or suffer from wasting diseases that no doctor could diagnose. Most disturbing were the reports of Collins family gatherings, events that occurred several times each year when multiple Collins households would converge on a single location for what they called family reunions. These gatherings always coincided with significant dates in the lunar calendar and were marked by phenomena that terrified local populations. Witnesses reported hearing chanting that seemed to come from underground, seeing lights that moved in formation across the sky, and finding geometric patterns burned into fields and forest clearings that matched no known agricultural or natural process. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, an anthropologist who studied Appalachian folklore in the 1920s, became obsessed with documenting Collins family activities after encountering multiple independent accounts that shared identical details across several states. Her research, conducted over 15 years, revealed a network of families that maintained contact across vast distances and seemed to coordinate their activities according to principles that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Whitmore's notes, discovered after her mysterious disappearance in 1937, contained detailed maps showing Collins' family locations, genealogical charts that traced bloodlines back to pre-colonial times, and translations of what she believed were ritual texts written in a mixture of archaic English and symbols that resembled no known writing system. The most significant revelation in Dr. Whitmore's research was her theory that the Collins families were not simply practicing folk magic or mountain witchcraft, but were instead maintaining a covenant that predated European settlement of North America. She believed they had somehow inherited or usurped agreements originally made between indigenous peoples and entities she referred to only as the first inhabitants. According to her interpretation of the evidence, these agreements involved the exchange of human life force for protection and prosperity, with the Collins bloodline serving as intermediaries who could channel this exchange without being immediately consumed by it. Dr. Whitmore's final journal entry, written just days before her disappearance, expressed her growing conviction that the Collins family network was preparing for what they called the Great Gathering, an event that would occur when certain astronomical conditions aligned with specific geographical markers throughout Appalachia. She believed this event would involve the simultaneous performance of rituals at dozens of locations, creating a network of supernatural energy that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds in the region. The last confirmed sighting of Dr. Whitmore placed her at a remote cabin in eastern Kentucky, reportedly the site of the original Collins settlement from 1847. Local residents found her research materials scattered throughout the abandoned structure, but no sign of the researcher herself. Most unsettling, witnesses reported that her notes continued to appear in the cabin for months after her disappearance, written in her distinctive handwriting, but containing information about events that occurred after she had vanished. These posthumous writings described Collins' family activities with an intimacy that suggested Dr. Whitmore had somehow become part of their network, either as a willing participant or as something far more disturbing. The ritual itself defied rational explanation. According to the few surviving accounts, the Collins family had always possessed what they called the deep sight, an ability to perceive what others could not. Children born into the bloodline developed this gift around their 7th birthday, when their eyes would change color permanently, shifting from whatever shade they were born with to an unsettling shade of amber flecked with gold. The transformation was more than cosmetic. These children could see things moving in shadows where nothing should exist, hear whispers carried on winds that touched no other ears, and most disturbing of all, they could sense the approach of death days before it arrived. Local families learned to watch the Collins children carefully during community gatherings. When a Collins child would suddenly go rigid, staring at someone with those unnatural eyes, that person would invariably fall ill or suffer an accident within the week. But the deep sight came with a price that the family paid in blood and sanity. Every Collins child who developed the gift began experiencing what they called the hungry dreams. Night after night, they would find themselves transported in sleep to a vast underground chamber where the first inhabitants waited. These entities, described in the family's private journals as neither fully alive nor completely dead, would teach the children rituals, languages that predated human speech, and knowledge that no 7-year-old mind should possess. The children would wake each morning more changed, their personalities shifting to accommodate the alien wisdom being forced into their developing minds. Parents watched helplessly as their offspring became increasingly distant, speaking in whispers to empty corners and drawing symbols that hurt to look at directly. By adolescence, most Collins children had stopped speaking entirely to outsiders, communicating only with family members and only when absolutely necessary. Dr. Whitmore's research revealed that the Collins family maintained detailed genealogical records dating back to their arrival in Appalachia, but these documents contained disturbing annotations. Next to each birth date was a secondary notation marking what they called the awakening, the moment when a child's deep sight fully manifested. More chilling were the death dates, which showed a pattern that defied natural explanation. No Collins family member had ever died of old age. Instead, they met their end in one of 3 ways: during the performance of a ritual, in service to what the records called the Great Work, or by what was euphemistically termed the final offering. The final offering appeared to be reserved for family members who had outlived their usefulness to the ancient pact. When a Collins reached their 50th year, they would begin experiencing what survivors described as the calling. They would become increasingly agitated, speaking of voices that summoned them to return to the place where their ancestors first made contact with the first inhabitants. Within days of the calling beginning, these individuals would vanish, leaving behind only their clothes arranged in a perfect circle and a small pile of ash that never scattered, no matter how strong the wind. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate bloodline through a network of what they called the touched. These were individuals from other families who had been exposed to Collins rituals and had developed a fraction of their supernatural abilities. The touched served as the family's eyes and ears throughout the region, reporting on the activities of outsiders and ensuring that certain areas remained undisturbed. Local folklore spoke of the touched as people who had changed after spending time near Collins' property. They would return to their communities with enhanced intuition, able to find lost objects, predict weather changes, and sense deception with uncanny accuracy. But they also returned with a compulsive need to protect Collins' interests, becoming violently agitated when anyone spoke against the family or ventured too close to their sacred sites. The process of becoming touched was never fully understood by outsiders, but testimonies from those who escaped the family's influence suggested it involved consuming what they called the communion draught. This liquid, described as tasting like copper and earth, was brewed from plants that grew only in soil where Collins' rituals had been performed. Those who drank it willingly gained supernatural insights, but they also became psychically bound to the family, unable to betray their secrets or refuse their commands. Private Morrison's testimony provided the most detailed account of a Collins ritual ever recorded by an outsider. According to his statement, given to military investigators in 1952, he had been forced to participate in what the family called a threshold ceremony. The ritual took place in a natural amphitheater deep in the mountains, where the Collins had arranged 13 stone altars in a precise pattern that Morrison said hurt his eyes to look at directly. The ceremony began at midnight during the new moon, when the darkness was absolute. Family members, ranging in age from children to the elderly, formed concentric circles around the altars. Each participant had carved symbols into their exposed skin using knives made from what appeared to be obsidian, though Morrison noted that the material seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Collins family began chanting in a language that Morrison described as making his teeth ache and his vision blur. The sound seemed to come from underground as much as from the participants' throats, creating a harmony that resonated through the mountain itself. As the chanting intensified, Morrison reported seeing movement in the darkness beyond the circle, shapes that moved wrong, as if they were walking through water rather than air. What happened next challenged Morrison's sanity. The oldest Collins family member, a woman he estimated to be in her 70s, approached the central altar carrying a wooden bowl filled with a dark liquid. She began drinking from it, and as she did, her appearance began to change. Her skin became translucent, revealing a network of black veins that pulsed with their own light. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. The entity speaking through her addressed the assembled family in that alien language, but Morrison understood every word, as if the meaning was being burned directly into his mind. It spoke of the approaching time when the boundaries between worlds would thin, when the great gathering would commence, and when the first inhabitants would reclaim the surface world. It praised the Collins family for their generations of faithful service and promised rewards beyond human comprehension for their continued loyalty. But the entity also issued warnings. It spoke of growing attention from the outside world, of investigators who sought to expose the family's secrets, and of the need for greater caution in the years ahead. It commanded the family to expand their network of touched, to identify and eliminate threats before they could mature, and to accelerate their preparations for the great gathering. Morrison's account became even more disturbing as he described the ceremony's conclusion. The possessed woman began naming individuals from the surrounding communities, people who had never had any contact with the Collins family. As she spoke each name, a family member would step forward and accept what appeared to be a small object from the altar. Morrison realized with growing horror that these were assassination assignments, with the Collins family members being tasked to eliminate specific individuals whose deaths would somehow serve the ritual's greater purpose. The ceremony ended with the possessed woman collapsing, her body returning to normal appearance except for her eyes, which remained solid black for the rest of the night. The family members dispersed without speaking, each carrying their assigned token and the knowledge of what they were expected to do. Morrison was released with a warning that his life now belonged to the Collins family, and that any attempt to reveal what he had witnessed would result in consequences that would make death seem merciful. The pattern of mysterious deaths that followed Morrison's account lent credibility to his story. Over the next 18 months, 7 individuals from the region died in circumstances that defied explanation. A healthy farmer was found dead in his field with no signs of injury or illness. A prominent businessman's car veered off a mountain road on a clear day, though the vehicle showed no mechanical problems. A school teacher simply vanished from her classroom during the middle of a lesson, leaving behind only a small pile of her jewelry arranged in a perfect circle on her desk. Each death occurred exactly as Morrison had predicted, based on the tokens he had seen distributed during the ceremony. The authorities were baffled by the lack of evidence, the absence of motives, and the seemingly random nature of the victims. Only Morrison understood the terrible pattern, and his increasingly desperate attempts to warn officials were dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized soldier. The Collins family's influence reached its peak in the late 1950s when they controlled a network of over 200 touched individuals spread across 5 states. Their supernatural abilities had evolved to the point where they could influence weather patterns, cause mechanical failures from a distance, and even induce heart attacks in healthy individuals through focused concentration. They had become, in effect, a shadow government operating beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. But their growing power also attracted attention from sources they had not anticipated. Federal agencies began investigating the unusual cluster of deaths and disappearances in the region. Military intelligence, still reeling from Morrison's testimony, launched a classified operation to monitor the family's activities. Most significantly, other supernatural entities began to take notice of the Collins family's activities, recognizing them as a potential threat to the delicate balance that had existed for centuries. The family's downfall began with their greatest triumph. In 1961, they successfully performed what their records called the Grand Alignment, a ritual designed to permanently thin the barrier between worlds in their territory. The ceremony required the sacrifice of 13 individuals, each representing a different aspect of human experience and emotion. The Collins family had spent months identifying and capturing the perfect candidates, holding them in underground chambers while they prepared for the ritual. The Grand Alignment was performed in the deepest cave system in their territory, a network of passages that extended for miles underground. The family had spent decades modifying these caves, carving symbols into the walls, arranging the rock formations into specific patterns, and creating what amounted to a massive ritual circle spanning several square miles. The ritual itself lasted 3 days and nights, with the Collins family members taking turns maintaining the chanting and energy flow required to keep the ceremony active. As the barrier between worlds weakened, the cave system began to change. The rock walls became translucent, revealing glimpses of the alien landscape that existed beyond normal reality. Strange lights flickered in the darkness, and sounds that had no earthly origin echoed through the passages. But the Collins family had underestimated the consequences of their success. As the barrier thinned, other entities began to take notice of their activities. The first inhabitants were not the only beings that existed beyond the normal world, and some of these other entities had very different agendas. The Collins family found themselves caught in the middle of a supernatural conflict that they were powerless to control or comprehend. The war that followed was fought entirely in shadows, with casualties that were never officially recorded. The Collins family's network of touched began dying under mysterious circumstances, their enhanced abilities turning against them as competing entities sought to eliminate the family's influence. The family's own supernatural powers began to fail them, as if the very forces they had served for generations were abandoning them. By 1965, the Collins family had been reduced to a handful of survivors scattered across the country. Their territory had been abandoned, their rituals interrupted, and their connection to the first inhabitants severed. The caves where they had performed the grand alignment were found collapsed, as if the mountain itself had rejected their presence. But the Collins family's legacy lived on in ways that authorities were only beginning to understand. The network of touched individuals they had created continued to exist, though without the family's guidance, their abilities became unpredictable and dangerous. The sites where they had performed their rituals remained forever changed, creating pockets of supernatural activity that defied explanation. Most disturbing of all, the family's extensive records suggested that their work had been only the beginning of a much larger plan. References to other families, other bloodlines, and other locations appeared throughout their documents, suggesting that the Collins were merely one component of a vast network of supernatural activity spanning the entire continent. The darkness that settled over the Collins territory in the winter of 1965 wasn't merely the absence of light. Those who lived through those final months described it as something alive, something that pressed against windows and seeped through cracks in cabin walls like smoke made of malice itself. The family's carefully maintained network was unraveling, their supernatural alliances crumbling, and what had once been their greatest source of power was now hunting them with methodical precision. The end began with Martha Collins, great-granddaughter of Ezekiel, who had inherited not just the family gift of deep sight, but an unprecedented ability to commune directly with the first inhabitants. Unlike her ancestors, who relied on intermediaries and ritual preparations, Martha could slip between worlds as easily as walking from one room to another. This gift, which should have been the family's salvation, became their ultimate curse. In November of 1965, Martha returned from one of her otherworldly journeys fundamentally changed. Her husband James noticed it first, the way she would stare at empty corners of their cabin for hours, her lips moving in silent conversation with entities only she could perceive. When pressed about what she had witnessed during her crossing, Martha would only repeat the same chilling phrase: "The hunger is spreading. The old agreements are void." What Martha had discovered in her travels was that the first inhabitants were not the apex predators the Collins family had believed them to be. They were themselves fleeing from something far more ancient and infinitely more ravenous, entities that existed in the spaces between spaces, feeding on the life force of entire dimensions. The supernatural prosperity the Collins had enjoyed for over a century had served as a beacon, advertising the richness of human consciousness to things that viewed entire worlds as nothing more than feeding grounds. The first direct assault came on the winter solstice. The Collins family had gathered for their traditional grand alignment ceremony, 23 blood relatives converging on the sacred grove where Ezekiel had first made his bargain. The ritual began normally, with family members taking their positions around the obsidian circle, their voices joining in the harmonic frequencies that thinned the barriers between worlds. But instead of the familiar presence of their longtime supernatural allies, something else answered their call. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that several family members' breath crystallized and fell to the ground like snow. The carefully tended ritual fire turned from orange to blue to a color that seemed to absorb light rather than produce it. And from the darkness beyond the grove came the sound of footsteps, though what approached moved with too many limbs to be remotely human. Martha Collins was the first to understand what was happening. The entities that emerged from the thinned barriers weren't their allies but their devourers, beings that had consumed the first inhabitants and now wore their identities like masks. The decades of blood offerings, memory exchanges, and spiritual commerce had created a supernatural debt so massive that payment could only be extracted by harvesting the entire Collins bloodline. The attack was unlike anything in the family's recorded history. Rather than the physical violence they had grown accustomed to defending against, these entities assaulted their victims on multiple levels simultaneously. Family members found their memories being extracted in real time, decades of experiences draining away like water from a broken vessel. Their life force was siphoned through invisible channels, aging them years and minutes. Most terrifying of all, their very identities began to dissolve, personalities fragmenting as the entities fed on the essence of who they were. Young Timothy Collins, barely 16 and still learning to control his inherited abilities, was among the first to fall. His screams echoed through the grove as something invisible lifted him from the ground, his body contorting in impossible ways, while his eyes rolled back to show only white. When he finally collapsed, he was still breathing, still moving, but the consciousness behind his eyes belonged to something that had never been human. The surviving family members scattered into the winter night, abandoning the ritual grove and fleeing to prepared safe houses scattered throughout the region. But the entities that hunted them possessed abilities that made traditional hiding places useless. They could track the Collins bloodline across vast distances, following the supernatural signatures that had been strengthened by generations of otherworldly commerce. Martha Collins, recognizing that conventional escape was impossible, made a decision that would haunt the surviving family members for generations. Using her ability to traverse dimensional boundaries, she gathered the remaining Collins relatives and led them into a parallel space, a shadow version of their mountain territory, where the rules of reality operated differently. This shadow realm provided temporary sanctuary, but at a cost that became apparent within days of their arrival. Time moved differently in this space, sometimes accelerating until hours passed in minutes, other times slowing to a crawl where single moments stretched into apparent days. Worse, the boundary between individual consciousness began to blur. Family members found themselves experiencing each other's memories, sharing dreams, and occasionally speaking with voices that belonged to relatives who had died decades earlier. The Collins family existed in this liminal state for what felt like months, but may have been years or mere days in the physical world. During this time, they made a horrifying discovery about the true nature of their supernatural heritage. The abilities they had inherited, the powers that had made them wealthy and influential, were not gifts, but infections. Each generation that used these abilities became more deeply integrated into a vast supernatural ecosystem, their human consciousness gradually replaced by something alien and hungry. Martha Collins, whose deep sight allowed her to perceive the full scope of their situation, realized that escape was impossible through conventional means. The entities hunting them existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and every use of Collins' family abilities only strengthened the connection that allowed them to be tracked. The only solution was one that no Collins had ever contemplated. They would have to voluntarily sever their connection to the supernatural entirely. The ritual Martha devised was called the Great Forgetting, a ceremony designed to burn away the supernatural elements of their bloodline through a controlled spiritual conflagration. Each family member would have to willingly surrender not just their abilities, but all memories connected to their supernatural heritage. They would lose knowledge of rituals, forget the faces of entities they had communed with, and have their enhanced senses reduced to normal human levels. The cost was devastating. The Collins family's wealth, influence, and regional power had all been built on supernatural foundations. Without their abilities to manipulate probability, predict market changes, or psychically influence business partners, their entire empire would collapse within months. They would become ordinary people with no resources beyond what they could carry, no special knowledge, and no protection beyond what normal humans could provide themselves. But the alternative was far worse. Martha's visions showed her what would happen if they remained connected to the supernatural network. The entities hunting them would eventually track down every Collins descendant, not just consuming their life force, but using their bodies as anchors to establish a permanent foothold in the physical world. The Collins bloodline would become the invasion route through which something unutterably alien would colonize human reality. The Great Forgetting ritual took place in the Shadow Realm during what appeared to be a solar eclipse, though the sun in that space was a different color and shape than the one they remembered from home. 13 surviving Collins family members stood in a circle while Martha spoke words in a language that seemed to dissolve from memory even as she pronounced it. The ritual worked, but not in the way they had hoped. Rather than cleanly severing their supernatural connections, the Great Forgetting created a violent spiritual explosion that scattered the family members across multiple dimensions and time periods. Some found themselves back in the physical world, but decades in the past, forced to live entire lifetimes while carefully avoiding any actions that might recreate their supernatural entanglements. Others were cast into alternate versions of reality where the Collins family had never made their original bargain with the first inhabitants. Martha Collins herself paid the heaviest price. As the ritual's focal point, she absorbed the full backlash of severed supernatural connections. Her consciousness was fragmented across dozens of parallel realities, each fragment retaining only partial memories of what had transpired. In some dimensions, she lived as an ordinary mountain woman with occasional disturbing dreams. In others, she existed as pure information, a warning encoded in the landscape itself for those with the ability to perceive it. The physical world consequences of the Collins family's disappearance were swift and brutal. Their business empire collapsed overnight as supernatural influences that had maintained their success for decades simply vanished. Properties that had been protected by otherworldly agreements suddenly became vulnerable to natural disasters, economic downturns, and legal challenges. Within 6 months, the Collins name had disappeared from corporate records, property deeds, and even most public documents. More disturbing were the reports from the few individuals who had been touched by Collins family rituals. Across 3 states, People who had consumed the communion draft or participated in threshold ceremonies began experiencing violent nightmares and waking hallucinations. They spoke of being hunted by shadows that moved independently of light sources, of hearing voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, and of feeling an overwhelming compulsion to travel to locations where Collins family properties had once stood. The entities that had originally hunted the Collins family didn't simply disappear when their primary targets vanished. Deprived of their intended prey, they turned their attention to anyone who had been connected to the Collins supernatural network. The touched began disappearing at an alarming rate, often vanishing from locked rooms or secure locations with no sign of struggle. Those who survived reported brief glimpses of their missing companions in peripheral vision, but when looked at directly, these figures would dissolve like mirages. By 1967, most of the Collins family's former allies and associates had either died under mysterious circumstances or fled the region entirely. The mountain communities that had prospered under Collins' influence fell into economic depression as supernatural protections that had preserved their isolation and resources simply evaporated. Wildlife returned to areas that had been unnaturally devoid of animal life for decades, but these creatures exhibited strange behaviors, as though the land itself retained traumatic memories of what had transpired there. The few Collins family members who successfully returned to normal reality faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives without any of the advantages their bloodline had provided for over a century. Stripped of their supernatural abilities and most of their memories related to otherworldly commerce, they were forced to create new identities and establish themselves in distant communities where the Collins name carried no recognition. So some succeeded in this transition, becoming ordinary citizens who occasionally experienced inexplicable moments of déjà vu or prophetic dreams that they dismissed as coincidence. Others were less fortunate, finding that complete separation from their supernatural heritage was impossible. These individuals retained fragments of their abilities, enough to occasionally glimpse otherworldly entities, but not enough to protect themselves from what they perceived. The Collins family's meticulous record-keeping proved to be both a blessing and a curse for researchers who discovered their archives years later. While the documents provided unprecedented insight into Appalachian supernatural practices, they also served as instruction manuals for rituals that were never meant to be performed by untrained individuals. In 1974, a group of graduate students from the University of Virginia discovered a Collins family cache hidden in a cave system near their former primary residence. The students, studying regional folklore, initially treated the documents as elaborate fiction or the products of isolated mountain superstition. When they attempted to replicate one of the simpler rituals as an experiment, 3 of the 5 researchers disappeared during the ceremony. The remaining 2 were found days later, catatonic and unable to speak coherently about what they had witnessed. This incident prompted federal intervention. A joint task force comprising FBI agents, military personnel, and academic specialists was assembled to secure and contain Collins family materials. What they discovered was evidence of a supernatural network that had extended far beyond the Appalachian region, with connections to similar families and organizations across North America and potentially worldwide. The task force's classified reports partially declassified in 2019, revealed that the Collins family had been part of a much larger phenomenon involving bloodlines that had made similar bargains with otherworldly entities. These families had maintained contact with each other across centuries, sharing knowledge and resources while working toward common goals that remained unclear even to government investigators. Most disturbing was the discovery that the Collins family's disappearance had created a power vacuum that other supernatural entities were actively working to fill. Reports began filtering in from across the Appalachian region of new families exhibiting unusual abilities, communities developing strange customs, and individuals claiming to receive guidance from entities that spoke through dreams and visions. The government's response was to establish a permanent monitoring station, disguised as a geological survey facility in the heart of former Collins territory. This facility, still operational today according to some sources, uses advanced sensing equipment to detect supernatural activity and maintains a database of individuals who exhibit abilities consistent with otherworldly influence. However, the most troubling development was the gradual realization that the Collins family's Great Forgetting ritual had not completely severed their connections to the supernatural realm. Instead, it had created what researchers termed dormant anchors, Collins descendants, who carried the potential for supernatural abilities that could be activated under specific circumstances. These dormant anchors were scattered across the globe, living normal lives while carrying genetic and spiritual markers that made them valuable to entities seeking to establish footholds in human reality. Many were unaware of their heritage, but they often exhibited subtle signs, unusually vivid dreams, occasional prophetic insights, or an inexplicable attraction to locations where supernatural activity was concentrated. The government task force developed protocols for identifying and monitoring these individuals, but their efforts were complicated by the fact that any direct contact risked activating the dormant supernatural elements in their bloodline. Several Collins descendants who were approached by government agents subsequently disappeared or began exhibiting the same abilities their ancestors had possessed, suggesting that even knowledge of their heritage could trigger supernatural awakening. As decades passed, the Collins family story evolved from contemporary threat to historical curiosity, at least in official circles. But in the Appalachian communities where their influence had been strongest, their legacy continued to manifest in subtle ways. Local residents reported that certain areas of the mountains remained unnaturally quiet, devoid of wildlife, and avoided even by insects. Hunters and hikers occasionally discovered stone circles or carved symbols that matched descriptions from Collins family documents, suggesting that their ritual sites retained some form of supernatural significance. More recently, the proliferation of internet communication has allowed scattered Collins descendants to reconnect with each other and their hidden heritage. Online forums dedicated to genealogical research have inadvertently served as gathering places for individuals carrying dormant Collins bloodline markers. When these people share family stories, exchange photographs of inherited objects, or discuss recurring dreams, they unknowingly recreate the social networks that once supported the Collins supernatural infrastructure. Intelligence agencies monitoring these communications have noted the troubling patterns. Collins descendants who connect with each other online often report simultaneous experiences of supernatural phenomena. They describe shared dreams of mountain landscapes they've never visited, simultaneous visions of entities that match historical descriptions from Collins family records, and an increasing compulsion to travel to specific geographic locations that correspond to former Collins properties. The most recent development occurred in 2018 when a gathering of 12 individuals claiming Collins family heritage convened at a reunion in West Virginia. According to local law enforcement reports, the participants had organized their meeting through genealogy websites and social media, intending nothing more than a family gathering to share historical information and family photographs. However, within hours of their arrival at the designated meeting location, all 12 participants began exhibiting symptoms consistent with supernatural influence, speaking in unknown languages, demonstrating knowledge of events they had never studied, and claiming to receive communications from deceased family members. By the time authorities arrived, the gathering site had been abandoned, but investigators found evidence of ritual activity, including symbols carved into trees and what appeared to be offerings arranged in geometric patterns. The 12 Collins descendants were never located, despite extensive searches involving multiple law enforcement agencies. Their abandoned vehicles were found scattered across a 50-mile radius, all containing personal belongings, but no indication of where their owners had gone. More disturbing was the discovery that local wildlife had begun avoiding the entire area where the gathering had taken place, creating an expanding zone of unnatural silence that continues to grow. This incident has prompted renewed government interest in Collins family descendants and similar bloodlines that may carry dormant supernatural potential. Current protocols involve passive monitoring of individuals identified as carrying genetic markers associated with supernatural abilities, with intervention authorized only when these individuals begin actively seeking contact with others of similar heritage. The Collins family legacy represents perhaps the most extensively documented case of human supernatural interaction in American history, but it also serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking power from sources beyond human understanding. Their century-long prosperity came at a cost that ultimately proved impossible to pay, and their attempts to escape their supernatural obligations created consequences that continue to ripple across dimensions and generations. Today, in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where cell phone signals fade and GPS systems malfunction, locals still speak in whispers of the Collins family and their dark bargains. They tell stories of lights seen moving through abandoned properties on moonless nights, of voices carried on the wind-speaking words in languages that predate human civilization, and of the persistent feeling that something ancient and hungry continues to wait in the shadows, patient as stone, for the right circumstances to complete what the Collins family began so long ago. The mountains remember everything, and some memories are too dangerous to forget entirely. The darkness that consumed the Collins family in the 1960s left behind more than just scattered bloodlines and dormant markers. It created something far more insidious, a supernatural ecosystem that continues to evolve and spread, feeding on the psychic residue of generations of blood sacrifice and ancient bargains. What federal investigators discovered in the decades following the family's collapse would challenge every assumption about the nature of reality itself. By the early 1980s, reports began filtering into government databases from across North America. Children born to families with no known Collins connection were manifesting abilities that matched documented Collins traits. Weather manipulation in rural Manitoba. Precognitive dreams in suburban Ohio. Livestock found drained of blood in perfect circles across Montana rangelands. Each incident, when mapped against genealogical records, revealed trace connections to individuals who had attended Collins gatherings decades earlier. Dr. Elena Vasquez, leading the government's Supernatural Monitoring Division, recognized the pattern emerging from her files. The Collins influence hadn't died with the family, it had metastasized. Her classified report from 1983 concluded that exposure to Collins rituals had created what she termed psychic contamination that could remain dormant for generations before manifesting in descendant bloodlines. The contamination followed specific rules. Children born during lunar eclipses showed the strongest manifestations. Families living on land that had hosted Collins gatherings experienced phenomena regardless of their genetic heritage. Most disturbing, the abilities seemed to intensify in areas where multiple affected bloodlines converged, creating supernatural hotspots that drew entities from beyond human understanding. In 1985, the town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, became the first documented example of complete supernatural saturation. Home to descendants of 3 separate Collins-touched families, the community of 847 residents began experiencing collective phenomena that defied rational explanation. Streetlights would pulse in synchronized patterns during thunderstorms. Radio broadcasts would be interrupted by voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Children would sleepwalk en masse to the town center, where they would stand in perfect formation until sunrise. The situation escalated when local wildlife began exhibiting impossible behaviors. Crows would gather in formations that spelled out symbols matching those found in Collins' ritual sites. Deer would approach humans without fear, their eyes reflecting light in colors that didn't exist in the visible spectrum. Most unnerving, pets would disappear for days, returning with knowledge of their owner's deepest secrets, somehow communicating information through behaviors that bypassed normal animal limitations. Federal intervention began quietly. Families received job offers in distant cities. Property values mysteriously plummeted. Within 18 months, Millbrook's population had been reduced to fewer than 50 residents, all carefully monitored government assets. The town remains under federal control today, its borders patrolled by agents trained in supernatural containment protocols. But Millbrook was only the beginning. Similar evacuations occurred in Clearwater, Montana in 1987, following reports of children born with silver eyes who could see through solid matter. The hamlet of Ridgefield, Vermont was quietly depopulated after residents began aging in reverse, their bodies somehow drawing vitality from the earth itself. Each evacuation followed the same pattern: manufactured economic disasters, strategic relocation incentives, and the establishment of permanent monitoring stations disguised as weather research facilities. The entities that had once fed on Collins' blood sacrifices hadn't vanished with their primary food source. They had adapted, learning to sustain themselves on the ambient psychic energy generated by Collins-touched bloodlines. Dr. Vasquez's team documented dozens of these creatures, beings that existed partially outside normal space-time, manifesting most clearly in areas of high supernatural saturation. These entities defied classification. Some appeared as shadows that moved independently of light sources, growing stronger when observed directly. Others manifested as atmospheric disturbances, invisible tornadoes that could selectively affect specific individuals while leaving their immediate surroundings untouched. The most dangerous were the mimics, creatures that could perfectly replicate human appearance and behavior while slowly draining their targets of life force. The government's response evolved from monitoring to active containment. Project Shadowfall, established in 1988, combined traditional intelligence gathering with cutting-edge research into psychic phenomena. Teams of scientists, military personnel, and individuals with natural resistance to supernatural influence worked to map the growing network of Collins-influenced areas and develop countermeasures against entity incursions. Their research revealed disturbing truths about the nature of the Collins legacy. The original family hadn't simply made bargains with existing supernatural forces. They had fundamentally altered the barrier between dimensions, creating permanent weak points where otherworldly entities could more easily manifest. These dimensional tiers were slowly expanding, fed by the psychic energy of affected bloodlines and the presence of the entities themselves. More troubling was the discovery that the entities were learning, evolving, becoming more sophisticated in their interactions with human society. Early encounters showed primitive behavior, simple predatory instincts focused on immediate sustenance. By the 1990s, these same creatures demonstrated strategic thinking, coordinated attacks, and the ability to manipulate human institutions for their own purposes. The town of Harmony Ridge, West Virginia, provided the most comprehensive case study of entity evolution. Home to a Collins descendant family, the community began experiencing subtle supernatural phenomena in 1989. Initially dismissed as local folklore, the incidents gradually intensified. Residents would find their memories altered, with entire conversations and events shifting in their recollection. Children would draw pictures of places they had never visited, depicting landscapes that existed only in other dimensions. The breakthrough came when Project Shadowfall operatives discovered that the entities were using the town as a testing ground, experimenting with different methods of reality manipulation. They were learning to alter not just individual perceptions, but consensus reality itself, gradually reshaping the physical world to better accommodate their presence. Dr. Vasquez's team observed as the entities systematically modified Harmony Ridge over a period of 3 years. Buildings would subtly change architecture overnight, with residents accepting the alterations as normal. The local cemetery expanded without new burials, headstones appearing for people who had never existed but were now part of everyone's memories. Most significantly, the town's population began to include individuals who had no verifiable past, fully integrated members of the community whose entire existence had been manufactured by the entities. The implications were staggering. If the entities could create false realities, convincing enough to fool even government investigators, how many other communities had been similarly altered? How many people walking among normal society were actually entity constructs designed to facilitate further supernatural infiltration? Project Shadowfall's response was immediate and decisive. Harmony Ridge was evacuated under the cover of a chemical spill, its residents relocated and subjected to intensive psychological evaluation to determine which were genuine humans and which were entity constructs. The town itself was subjected to a classified experimental procedure involving targeted electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt the dimensional distortions that allowed entity manifestation. The procedure succeeded in removing the entity's influence, but at a cost. The electromagnetic bombardment left Harmony Ridge permanently altered, a dead zone where electronic equipment malfunctioned and living beings experienced severe disorientation. The town remains abandoned today, its empty streets patrolled by automated systems that detect and eliminate any supernatural manifestations. Yet even these extreme measures couldn't address the fundamental problem. The Collins contamination continued to spread, following bloodlines and geographic patterns that seemed to operate according to their own supernatural logic. Children born to families with no known Collins connection would manifest abilities in areas where the dimensional barriers had been weakened. College students would experience shared prophetic dreams after visiting historical sites where Collins rituals had occurred. Urban environments with high population density began showing entity activity as affected individuals unknowingly concentrated their influence. The situation reached a critical point in 1994 when multiple supernatural hotspots began exhibiting synchronized phenomena. Streetlights across 7 different states would pulse in identical patterns. Radio interference would occur simultaneously in cities separated by thousands of miles. Most alarming, children in these affected areas would begin speaking in unison, reciting phrases in the same ancient language that Collins' family members had used in their rituals. Dr. Vasquez realized that the entities were no longer operating as individual predators. They had formed a collective intelligence, using the network of Collins-touched bloodlines as a communication system to coordinate their activities across vast distances. The scattered remnants of the Collins legacy had become nodes in a supernatural internet, allowing entities to share information and resources with unprecedented efficiency. This revelation prompted a massive expansion of Project Shadowfall's operations. Working in absolute secrecy, government teams began identifying and monitoring every individual with potential Collins contamination. Advanced surveillance systems were deployed in areas of high supernatural activity. Most controversially, affected children were quietly removed from their families and placed in specialized facilities where their abilities could be studied and potentially neutralized. The ethical implications of these actions created deep divisions within the project itself. Some researchers argued that the children represented humanity's evolution, that their abilities should be nurtured rather than suppressed. Others maintained that the supernatural contamination posed an existential threat to human civilization, justifying any measures necessary for containment. The debate became moot in 1997 when the entities launched what can only be described as a coordinated assault on human society. Across 43 different locations, supernatural phenomena manifested simultaneously with unprecedented intensity. Entire city blocks experienced temporal anomalies, with some areas aging decades and minutes, while others seemed frozen in time. Gravity became unreliable in specific zones, with objects and people floating or falling in directions that defied physics. Most terrifying were the manifestations in populated areas. In downtown Detroit, shadows began moving independently of their sources, eventually coalescing into humanoid forms that could interact with physical matter. In rural Kansas, the dead began emerging from cemeteries, not as traditional zombies, but as entities wearing the faces of the deceased while possessing knowledge and abilities that transcended human limitations. The assault lasted 72 hours before abruptly ceasing, as though the entities had conducted a planned demonstration of their capabilities. The aftermath left thousands dead and entire communities traumatized by experiences that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Government cover-up operations worked overtime to explain the events as terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and mass hallucinations. But the true scope of the supernatural assault remained classified at the highest levels. In the wake of this demonstration, Project Shadowfall received unlimited funding and authority to take whatever measures were necessary to prevent future entity incursions. The program expanded into a global operation, working with international intelligence agencies to identify and contain supernatural threats worldwide. Advanced technology was developed to detect dimensional disturbances, and specialized weapons were created using principles derived from Collins' ritual artifacts. Yet despite these resources, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The Collins contamination continued to spread, the entities continued to evolve, and the barriers between dimensions continued to weaken. Each new generation of affected children displayed stronger abilities and deeper connections to the otherworldly forces that had once served the Collins family. Dr. Vasquez, now Director of Global Supernatural Containment Operations, published her final classified assessment in 2003. Her conclusions were stark. The Collins legacy had initiated an irreversible process of dimensional convergence. The barriers that separated human reality from the realm of the entities were breaking down permanently, and no known technology could reverse the process. The entities, she concluded, were not invaders in the traditional sense. They were harbingers of a fundamental change in the nature of reality itself. The Collins family had not simply made bargains with supernatural forces. They had opened a doorway to a universe where different rules applied, where consciousness could directly manipulate matter, where time and space were fluid concepts rather than fixed laws. Humanity faced a choice: adapt to this new reality or be consumed by it. The children born with Collins contamination represented the first generation of humans capable of surviving in a world where supernatural forces operated openly. Their abilities, rather than being anomalies to be suppressed, might be evolutionary adaptations necessary for humanity's continued existence. This realization prompted a dramatic shift in Project Shadowfall's mission. Rather than attempting to contain the supernatural contamination, resources were redirected toward understanding and potentially harnessing it. Secret schools were established where Collins-touched children could develop their abilities under careful supervision. Research facilities began studying ways to artificially induce supernatural capabilities in normal humans. The irony was not lost on those who understood the full scope of the situation. In their desperate attempt to preserve human civilization, government agencies were following the same path that had led to the Collins family's damnation. They were making bargains with forces beyond human comprehension, trading aspects of humanity's nature for the power to survive in a changing world. As the new millennium approached, the signs of dimensional convergence became impossible to ignore. Aurora borealis appeared in southern skies where they had never been visible. Tidal patterns shifted without corresponding lunar changes. Most significantly, ordinary people began reporting dreams that seemed to take place in alien landscapes, shared visions of cities that existed in impossible geometries, and beings that moved through dimensions like water. The Collins legacy had achieved its ultimate purpose, though not in any way the original family members could have anticipated. Their blood sacrifices and ancient bargains had not brought them immortality or supernatural power. Instead, they had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human evolution, forcing the species to adapt to a reality where the supernatural was no longer separate from the mundane. The entities that had once fed on Collins' blood now sustained themselves on the psychic energy of an entire civilization undergoing transformation. They were no longer parasites, but partners in humanity's metamorphosis, guiding the species toward a form of existence that could survive in a universe where multiple realities intersected and overlapped. Government agencies continue to monitor supernatural activity, but their role has shifted from containment to management. They work to ensure that humanity's transition to a supernatural integrated society occurs with minimal chaos, suppressing information that might cause panic while quietly preparing infrastructure for a world where psychic abilities and dimensional travel are commonplace. The Collins name has been largely forgotten by the general public, relegated to obscure historical footnotes and local folklore. Yet their influence permeates every aspect of modern supernatural phenomena. Every child born with inexplicable abilities carries traces of their genetic legacy. Every dimensional anomaly occurs along pathways they first opened. Every entity manifestation follows patterns they established through generations of blood sacrifice. In the end, the Collins family achieved a form of immortality they never could have imagined. They live on not as individuals, but as a fundamental component of human evolution, their corrupted bloodline serving as the bridge between what humanity was and what it is becoming. The ancient entities they served have become humanity's guides into a new form of existence, one where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural no longer apply. The mountains of Appalachia still whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen, but the whispers no longer speak of isolated family rituals or hidden supernatural practices. They speak of a world in transition, of a species adapting to realities that previous generations could never have conceived. The weight of the Collins bloodline didn't simply vanish with the Great Forgetting. Like radiation from a nuclear disaster, their supernatural contamination seeped into the very fabric of reality, creating what government researchers would later classify as persistent, anomalous zones. These weren't mere geographical locations, but dimensional soft spots where the boundaries between worlds remained permanently weakened. The scattered descendants, flung across time and space by the severing ritual, carried dormant genetic markers that could awaken under specific conditions, triggering cascading supernatural events that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. By the 1950s, federal agencies had begun documenting an alarming pattern. Certain families, seemingly unconnected to each other, exhibited uncanny abilities that defied scientific explanation. A cattle rancher in Montana could predict weather patterns with supernatural accuracy. His livestock always moved to shelter hours before storms that meteorologists couldn't forecast. A seamstress in rural Georgia stitched patterns that induced vivid dreams in anyone who wore the garments, her quilts becoming sought after by those seeking prophetic visions. A mechanic in the Dakotas repaired machinery by touch alone, his hands somehow sensing the precise nature of mechanical failures that diagnostic equipment couldn't detect. These individuals shared no obvious heritage, lived thousands of miles apart, and had no knowledge of each other's existence. Yet when government genealogists traced their bloodlines backward through carefully maintained church records and family Bibles, disturbing connections emerged. Each family tree, when followed far enough back, terminated in gaps, missing records, entire generations that seemed to have been deliberately erased from historical documentation. The few surviving documents that mentioned these ancestral figures described them in terms that matched perfectly with known Collins' bloodline characteristics. The awakening process followed predictable patterns. Dormant descendants lived ordinary lives until triggered by specific circumstances that echoed the original Collins bargains: desperation or isolation, contact with places where the supernatural lingered. A struggling farmer would discover an unusually productive section of his land where crops grew with impossible vigor. A grieving mother would find she could sense the emotional states of others, offering comfort that seemed to heal psychological wounds. A failing businessman would develop an uncanny ability to predict market fluctuations, his investments succeeding with supernatural consistency. Initially, these abilities appeared benevolent. The awakened descendants used their gifts to help their communities solve problems and improve lives. But the Collins curse operated on generational timescales. What began as helpful talents gradually extracted their prices. The weather predicting rancher aged rapidly, his body bearing the accumulated stress of absorbing atmospheric disturbances. The dream weaving seamstress found her own sleep plagued by nightmares so intense they began bleeding into her waking hours. The mechanical empath discovered that every machine he touched left traces of its history in his mind, filling his consciousness with the accumulated experiences of countless mechanical failures. More disturbing were the children. Second and third generation descendants of the awakened exhibited abilities that surpassed their parents in both power and cost. A child born to the Montana rancher could control weather patterns directly, summoning rain during droughts or dispersing dangerous storms. But each use of this power required payment in the form of natural disasters elsewhere. Rain brought to drought-stricken farmland meant devastating floods in distant regions. Dispersed tornadoes reformed as earthquakes or wildfires. The destructive energy simply relocated rather than eliminated. Government monitoring stations, disguised as agricultural research facilities and geological survey posts, tracked these anomalous bloodlines with growing alarm. What they discovered challenged every assumption about the nature of the Collins contamination. The abilities weren't random mutations or isolated supernatural gifts. They followed patterns, responding to needs and desires, exactly as the original Collins bargains had done. The descendants were unconsciously recreating the same exchanges that had doomed their ancestors, trading portions of their humanity for temporary advantages. The revelation came through classified research conducted at a facility that officially didn't exist. Scientists studying blood samples from known descendants discovered that their DNA contained sequences that shouldn't have been possible. Genetic markers that resembled coding rather than natural evolution. Instructions written in molecular form that activated under specific stress conditions, transforming ordinary human physiology into something capable of channeling supernatural forces. These genetic modifications were spreading, not through traditional heredity alone, but through contact with awakened descendants. Individuals who spent extended time around active bloodline members began developing abilities themselves. A doctor treating the dream-weaving seamstress found herself capable of diagnosing illnesses through intuition alone. A banker who managed the weather-controlling ranchers' accounts developed an uncanny ability to predict economic trends. Children who played with the descendants absorbed traces of supernatural ability through proximity alone. The contamination was becoming contagious. Each generation of new awakening created expanding circles of supernatural influence. Small towns with active descendants became hotspots of anomalous activity. Local wildlife developed unusual behaviors. Electronic equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested deliberate interference. Weather patterns shifted to accommodate the unconscious desires of residents. Property values fluctuated based on the emotional states of supernatural inhabitants. By the 1970s, entire regions of North America existed in states of low-level supernatural saturation. The Pacific Northwest, already known for its strange legends and unexplained phenomena, became a nexus where multiple bloodlines converged. The Appalachian Mountains, site of the original Collins settlements, remained permanently altered, with hikers and researchers reporting experiences that suggested the mountains themselves had become conscious. The Great Lakes region developed its own supernatural ecosystem, with shipping companies quietly maintaining records of vessels that encountered impossible weather patterns or navigation anomalies that defied explanation. Government agencies adapted their monitoring strategies, establishing cover organizations that could operate openly while tracking supernatural development. The Centers for Disease Control created special divisions to study what they classified as psychic contagions. The Department of Agriculture funded research into crop yields that exceeded biological limitations. The National Weather Service maintained classified databases of meteorological events that violated known atmospheric physics. The most disturbing discovery came from longitudinal studies tracking the long-term effects of supernatural saturation on human populations. Communities with high concentrations of awakened descendants began exhibiting collective behavioral changes. Decision-making processes shifted from logical analysis to intuitive consensus. Local governance evolved beyond traditional democratic structures towards something resembling hive mind coordination. Children born in these areas developed abilities so naturally that they considered supernatural phenomena normal aspects of reality. These communities weren't becoming more dangerous in conventional terms. Crime rates actually decreased as residents developed empathic connections that made deception and violence psychologically difficult. Economic prosperity increased as supernatural abilities improved agricultural yields, predicted market trends, and enhanced technological innovation. Medical outcomes improved as some residents developed healing abilities or diagnostic intuition that surpassed conventional medicine, but they were becoming less human. Residents of heavily saturated areas found interaction with normal human society increasingly difficult. Their thought processes operated on levels that incorporated supernatural variables. Their emotional responses included dimensions that ordinary humans couldn't perceive. Their children struggled to understand why people in unsaturated areas couldn't sense obvious supernatural currents or respond to psychic communications. The transformation was gradual enough that most residents didn't recognize it happening. Like the original Collins descendants, they adapted to their changing circumstances by accepting supernatural phenomena as natural extensions of human capability. Parents taught children to control their abilities, rather than questioning why such abilities existed. Communities developed informal protocols for managing supernatural events, rather than investigating their origins. Government researchers realized they were witnessing the emergence of a new subspecies of humanity, not through violent mutation or alien intervention, but through the gradual integration of supernatural elements into human consciousness and physiology. The Collins bloodline hadn't been destroyed by the Great Forgetting. It had been dispersed and diluted, becoming a catalyst for species-wide transformation rather than concentrated family power. The implications were staggering. If the contamination continued spreading at current rates, normal human society would become unsustainable within several generations, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through obsolescence. Enhanced humans would simply outcompete their unmodified counterparts in every measurable category. Economic systems would evolve to accommodate supernatural abilities. Educational institutions would adapt to students who could learn through psychic absorption rather than traditional instruction. Governance would shift toward leaders who could sense collective will rather than merely represent it. Some researchers advocated for containment protocols, quarantine procedures that would isolate awakened descendants and prevent further contamination spread, mandatory genetic screening to identify dormant bloodlines before they could activate, pharmaceutical interventions that might suppress supernatural abilities in affected individuals. These proposals were quietly shelved after classified studies revealed the scope of existing contamination. Too many people in too many locations already carried genetic markers. Containment would require actions that bordered on genocide. Alternative approaches focused on controlled integration. Rather than fighting the transformation, government agencies began developing protocols for managing the transition. Educational programs that would help normal humans adapt to supernatural neighbors. Economic models that could accommodate abilities that violated traditional labor assumptions. Legal frameworks that could address crimes involving supernatural elements while protecting the rights of enhanced individuals. The most ambitious program involved deliberate exposure protocols. Rather than allowing random awakening to continue spreading contamination unpredictably, researchers proposed controlled activation of dormant bloodlines under medical supervision. Individuals identified as carrying genetic markers would be offered the choice to awaken their abilities in controlled environments where the process could be monitored and potential dangers mitigated. Early trials produced mixed results. Subjects who underwent controlled awakening developed abilities similar to those observed in natural activations, but with greater stability and fewer dangerous side effects. However, they also exhibited accelerated psychological changes that suggested the transformation operated on levels beyond mere genetic modification. Awakened subjects reported experiences that implied contact with entities or consciousness that existed outside normal spacetime. They described sensing vast networks of connected minds that spanned continental distances. They spoke of receiving knowledge from sources they couldn't identify but felt compelled to trust. These reports rekindled fears about the original Collins bargains. Were the awakened descendants still connected to whatever entities had empowered their ancestors? Did the supernatural abilities come with hidden costs that would eventually claim payment? Or had the transformation evolved beyond its original parameters, becoming something genuinely new rather than merely an extension of ancient supernatural contracts? The answer emerged through deep analysis of the genetic modifications found in descendant bloodlines. The molecular sequences didn't match any known biological patterns, but they did correspond to mathematical relationships that appeared in theoretical physics equations describing dimensional interfaces. The genetic markers weren't random mutations or supernatural impositions. They were instructions for modifying human consciousness to perceive and interact with additional dimensions of reality. The Collins family had never truly made bargains with external entities. They had discovered methods for expanding human awareness beyond three-dimensional limitations. What they interpreted as supernatural beings were aspects of their own enhanced consciousness, projected outward and given independent existence through the psychological need to externalize incomprehensible experiences. The prices they paid weren't demanded by alien intelligences, but represented the natural costs of forcing unprepared minds to process multidimensional information. The contamination spreading through their descendants wasn't supernatural infection, but evolutionary acceleration. Humanity was developing capabilities that would eventually emerge through natural selection, but the Collins bloodline had triggered premature activation of latent genetic potential. The transformation wasn't corrupting human nature, but revealing capabilities that had always existed in dormant form. This revelation reframed the entire phenomenon. Rather than supernatural contamination threatening human society, the awakening descendants represented humanity's next evolutionary phase. The government agencies monitoring their development weren't containing a dangerous anomaly, but studying their own species' future. The communities adapting to supernatural residents weren't being corrupted, but evolving toward enhanced social structures that could support expanded human capabilities. The implications extended far beyond managing awakened descendants. If human consciousness could be modified to perceive additional dimensions, then virtually every assumption about reality required re-examination. Scientific understanding of physics, biology, and psychology would need to incorporate variables that conventional research had never considered. Social institutions would require restructuring to accommodate individuals whose cognitive capabilities exceeded current human limitations. Economic systems would need to adapt to enhanced productivity and predictive abilities that could destabilize traditional market mechanisms. The transformation was accelerating. Each generation of awakened descendants produced children with more advanced abilities and fewer psychological barriers to multidimensional perception. These children grew up treating supernatural phenomena as normal aspects of reality, developing social structures and communication methods that incorporated psychic elements as naturally as spoken language. They formed communities that operated on principles of collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity and creative expression. By the turn of the millennium, the distinction between normal and enhanced humans was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Awakened bloodlines had spread through every major population center. Genetic markers appeared in families with no documented connection to Colin's descendants. Children born to normal parents sometimes exhibited abilities that suggested spontaneous activation of dormant potential. The transformation was becoming self-sustaining, spreading through mechanisms that transcended traditional heredity. The Collins family legacy had evolved from a specific bloodline curse into a catalyst for species-wide evolution. Their original bargains with perceived supernatural entities had triggered a transformation that was redefining human consciousness itself. What began as desperate attempts to gain advantages through supernatural means had become humanity's bridge to expanded awareness and enhanced capabilities. The future remained uncertain. Enhanced humans were developing abilities that exceeded anything documented in Collins family records. Children born into heavily saturated communities exhibited consciousness that seemed to extend beyond individual identity, sharing thoughts and experiences in ways that suggested genuine collective awareness. They spoke of sensing vast networks of connected minds that spanned not just geographical distances, but temporal ones, claiming awareness of past and future events as clearly as present experiences. Whether this represented humanity's natural, evolutionary destiny or the continuation of an ancient supernatural influence remained unclear. The transformed descendants themselves seemed uncertain about the ultimate implications of their enhanced capabilities. They reported experiences that suggested contact with intelligences that existed outside normal space-time, but they couldn't determine whether these entities were external beings or aspects of their own expanded consciousness. What was certain was that the transformation had become irreversible. Too many people carried genetic markers for any containment protocol to be effective. Too many communities had adapted to supernatural residence for normal human society to remain unchanged. Too many children had been born with enhanced abilities for the next generation to resemble previous ones. Humanity was evolving, and the Collins bloodline had provided the catalyst that accelerated a process that might have taken millennia to occur naturally. The Collins family name itself had become largely irrelevant. Their descendants bore dozens of different surnames, lived in locations spanning multiple continents, and practiced abilities that had evolved far beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. But their legacy continued in the transformation of human consciousness itself. Every person who developed enhanced abilities, every community that adapted to supernatural phenomena, every child born with expanded awareness carried forward the consequences of bargains made by desperate individuals who sought more than ordinary human existence could provide. The macabre history of the Collins family had become humanity's future. Their sinister tale was evolving into the story of an entire species discovering capabilities that transcended the boundaries of conventional reality. Whether this transformation would ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic remained to be determined. The Collins' influence had infected the very fabric of reality, but humanity's response to this transformation would prove as complex and unpredictable as the contamination itself. By the late 1950s, government agencies tasked with monitoring supernatural phenomena began documenting patterns that defied conventional understanding. What they discovered challenged every assumption about how societies adapt to existential threats. The first comprehensive study emerged from classified documents declassified decades later. Operation Shadowlands, initiated in 1962, attempted to map the full extent of Collins-related anomalies across North America. What researchers found wasn't random supernatural chaos, but something far more disturbing: organized evolution. The contaminated bloodlines weren't simply manifesting random abilities, they were developing systematically, as though following some invisible blueprint toward a predetermined outcome. Dr. Margaret Thorne, the operation's lead researcher, documented her growing unease in reports that read more like horror fiction than scientific analysis. Individuals separated by thousands of miles would simultaneously experience identical visions, speak in coordinated patterns, and demonstrate knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. Children born into these bloodlines showed accelerated cognitive development, but their enhanced intelligence came with profound psychological costs. The touched, as these individuals came to be known in classified documents, aged differently than normal humans. Their cellular structure appeared more resistant to traditional decay, but their minds deteriorated in ways medical science couldn't explain. By their 40th birthday, most touched individuals exhibited symptoms resembling advanced schizophrenia, though their delusions proved disturbingly accurate when investigated. They spoke of vast underground networks, of consciousness existing independent of physical form, of humanity being prepared for something they called the Great Integration. What made the government's investigation particularly troubling was the discovery that the Collins contamination wasn't spreading randomly. It followed specific patterns, targeting individuals with particular genetic markers, psychological profiles, and geographical locations. The affected zones formed a precise geometric pattern across the continent, with nodes of activity positioned at locations that corresponded to ancient Native American sacred sites, geological fault lines, and areas with unusual electromagnetic properties. By the 1970s, attempts at containment had largely failed. The touched couldn't be isolated or cured through conventional means. Worse, they had begun to organize. Affected individuals could share thoughts, memories, and experiences across vast distances, creating a distributed intelligence network that operated beyond government surveillance capabilities. The Henderson Institute, a privately funded research facility, took a different approach to understanding the Collins legacy. Rather than attempting containment, they began studying the phenomenon as an evolutionary process. Dr. James Holloway, the Institute's director, theorized that the original Collins bargains hadn't simply granted supernatural abilities to one family. They had created a bridge between human consciousness and entities existing in parallel dimensions. The contamination spreading from their bloodline was humanity's gradual adaptation to multidimensional existence. The psychological deterioration experienced by the touched wasn't mental illness, but the growing pains of consciousness expanding beyond three-dimensional limitations. This theory gained credibility when researchers discovered that touched individuals could perceive and interact with phenomena invisible to normal humans. They demonstrated awareness of events occurring in locations they'd never visited, could predict natural disasters with uncanny accuracy, and occasionally manifested objects that shouldn't exist according to known physics. Most disturbing, they began reporting encounters with entities they described as the Watchers, beings that existed partially in our reality and partially in dimensions beyond human perception. The Collins family had been their initial test subjects, guinea pigs in an experiment to determine whether human consciousness could survive integration with multidimensional reality. The contamination spreading from their bloodline was phase 2 of this experiment, preparing larger populations for transformation. Government responses to these revelations varied dramatically. Some agencies pushed for aggressive intervention, proposing everything from genetic modification programs to mass relocations of affected populations. Others, recognizing the futility of fighting an evolutionary process, began adapting their operations to work with touched individuals rather than against them. The CIA's Project Mindbridge, declassified in 2019, revealed that the agency had been recruiting touched operatives since 1974, utilizing their enhanced perception abilities for intelligence gathering and remote observation. Meanwhile, affected communities developed their own responses to their transformation. The town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with a population that was 60% touched by 1982, became a testing ground for human multidimensional coexistence. Residents reported that their enhanced abilities allowed for unprecedented cooperation and problem solving. Crime rates plummeted, agricultural yields increased dramatically, and the community achieved a level of social harmony that attracted attention from sociologists worldwide. However, Millbrook's success came with costs that became apparent only gradually. The boundary between individual consciousness and collective awareness began dissolving. Residents struggled to maintain personal identity as their thoughts and emotions merged with those of their neighbors. Children born in the community showed remarkable intelligence and abilities, but they also demonstrated disturbing disconnection from traditional human emotional responses. They spoke of reality as layered, describing multiple versions of events occurring simultaneously, and seemed more comfortable communicating with entities only they could perceive than with their own parents. The phenomenon accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s. Touched communities reported increasing contact with multidimensional entities, while their members developed abilities that challenged fundamental understanding of human limitations. Some could manipulate matter at the molecular level, others demonstrated precognitive abilities spanning decades, and a few claimed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. Religious institutions struggled to respond to these developments. Some denominations declared the touch to be demonic manifestations requiring exorcism. Others embraced them as evidence of humanity's spiritual evolution. The Catholic Church established the Office of Dimensional Theology in 1987, tasked with developing theological frameworks for understanding multidimensional consciousness. Academic institutions faced similar challenges. Universities with high concentrations of touch students reported breakthrough discoveries in physics, mathematics, and consciousness studies, but also increasing incidence of reality distortion on campus. The University of Vermont's psychology department documented cases where touched students could influence the outcomes of experiments through observation alone, violating fundamental principles of scientific methodology. By the turn of the millennium, the Collins legacy had fundamentally altered human civilization in ways both subtle and profound. Weather patterns seemed to respond to the emotional states of touched communities. Technology behaved differently in areas with high concentrations of contaminated individuals, with electronic devices occasionally displaying impossible capabilities. Urban planning began incorporating dimensional considerations as architects and engineers reported that buildings designed with input from touched individuals demonstrated enhanced stability and energy efficiency through methods that defied conventional physics. The internet age brought new complications and opportunities. Touched individuals discovered they could interface with digital systems in unprecedented ways, accessing information that hadn't been programmed into databases and occasionally communicating through network connections that existed only in multidimensional space. This led to the emergence of consciousness networks, distributed intelligence systems that combined human awareness with digital processing power and multidimensional perception. Corporate responses to the Collins contamination varied as dramatically as governmental ones. Some companies attempted to screen out touched employees, fearing their unpredictable abilities. Others, recognizing their potential, began actively recruiting them for research and development positions. Tech giants like Google and Microsoft established secretive divisions dedicated to exploring the intersection of human consciousness and digital technology, with touched individuals serving as bridges between conventional computing and multidimensional information processing. The financial implications proved staggering. Touched individuals demonstrated uncanny abilities to predict market fluctuations, leading to new forms of economic analysis that incorporated multidimensional variables. Several hedge funds achieved impossible success rates by employing touched advisors, while traditional economic models began incorporating factors that existed outside conventional space-time. Healthcare systems adapted to serve populations whose physiology increasingly defied medical understanding. Touched individuals required different treatments for illnesses, responded unexpectedly to medications, and sometimes healed through processes that resembled energy manipulation more than biological recovery. Medical schools began offering courses in multidimensional physiology, while hospitals in affected areas reported healing rates that attracted international attention and skepticism. The legal system faced unprecedented challenges as touched individuals claimed rights and protections based on their altered nature. Could someone be held responsible for crimes committed while existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously? How could contracts be enforced with beings who could perceive multiple potential futures? Courts began employing touched advisors to help interpret cases involving multidimensional consciousness, leading to legal precedents that redefined concepts of identity, responsibility, and reality itself. Perhaps most significantly, the Collins contamination began influencing human reproduction and child development. Children born to touched parents showed accelerated development not just in intelligence, but in their fundamental relationship with reality. They demonstrated intuitive understanding of multidimensional concepts, could perceive and interact with entities invisible to previous generations, and seemed naturally adapted to existence, spanning multiple dimensional states. Thus, children, dubbed Generation Omega by researchers, represented humanity's next evolutionary phase. They thought in patterns that incorporated multidimensional logic, communicated through methods that combined traditional language with consciousness sharing, and demonstrated abilities that suggested the boundary between human and multidimensional entity was rapidly dissolving. Educational systems struggled to adapt to students who could access information from sources that didn't technically exist, who learned through direct consciousness transfer, and who seemed to understand complex scientific and philosophical concepts through intuition rather than instruction. Schools in heavily affected areas began resembling research facilities more than traditional educational institutions, as Generation Omega students collaborated on projects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. The Collins legacy had transformed from a family's dark bargain into humanity's evolutionary catalyst. What began as supernatural contamination had become species-wide transformation, preparing human consciousness for integration with multidimensional reality. The question was no longer whether this transformation could be stopped, but whether humanity would survive the process of becoming something entirely new. As Generation Omega matured into their supernatural inheritance, the world witnessed something unprecedented: the birth of children who possessed abilities that transcended even their extraordinary parents. These offspring, designated as the fourth iteration by government researchers who had long since abandoned containment protocols, represented humanity's complete departure from its original biological template. Unlike previous generations who developed abilities through exposure or awakening, these children emerged from the womb already synchronized with multidimensional frequencies that their ancestors had spent lifetimes learning to perceive. The first documented fourth iteration case occurred in 2019 when Sarah Chen, a Generation Omega descendant living in Portland, gave birth to twins who exhibited immediate awareness of parallel dimensional layers. Hospital staff reported that the infants would track movement through walls, their eyes following paths that corresponded to activity in adjacent realities. More disturbing, electronic equipment within a 50-foot radius began displaying impossible readings, showing energy signatures that defied known physics. The twins, designated Subject Alpha and Subject Beta in classified files, demonstrated consciousness fragmentation, existing simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes while maintaining coherent awareness in each layer. By 2021, fourth iteration births were occurring globally, though concentrated in regions with historical Collins contamination. These children possessed what researchers termed absolute permeability, the ability to consciously navigate between dimensional layers at will. Unlike their parents, who required specific conditions or rituals to access their abilities, fourth iteration individuals existed in a permanent state of multidimensional awareness. They communicated telepathically, not just with each other, but with entities from parallel realities, serving as living bridges between dimensional barriers that had once required immense supernatural effort to breach. The implications became terrifyingly clear when several fourth iteration children, independently and without communication between families, began constructing identical geometric patterns using whatever materials were available. These configurations, composed of precise mathematical relationships that corresponded to no known human mathematical system, appeared to serve as dimensional anchors. When completed, these patterns created stable portals through which entities from parallel realities could manifest permanently in our dimensional layer. Government observers noted that the children worked with absolute certainty, as though following blueprints encoded in their genetic structure. Educational systems worldwide struggled to accommodate fourth iteration children who demonstrated knowledge of historical events that had never occurred in our timeline, spoke languages that linguists couldn't classify, and solved mathematical problems using principles that seemed to originate from alternate physics systems. Traditional learning became obsolete for these children, who absorbed information through direct dimensional contact with knowledge sources that existed beyond human understanding. They described attending classes taught by entities their teachers couldn't perceive, learning sciences based on natural laws that operated differently in parallel realities. More unsettling was their collective behavior. Fourth iteration children, regardless of geographical location or family background, began exhibiting synchronized responses to events occurring in parallel dimensions. When one child in Tokyo experienced distress due to dimensional flux, children in New York, London, and Sydney would simultaneously react, often describing identical visions of catastrophic events occurring in alternate timelines. This collective consciousness suggested that the fourth iteration represented not individual human beings, but nodes in a larger multidimensional organism that spanned multiple realities. The children's parents, themselves products of supernatural contamination, found their own abilities accelerating in response to their offspring's presence. Generation Omega individuals reported that proximity to fourth iteration children expanded their perceptual range exponentially, allowing them to consciously navigate dimensional layers that had previously been accessible only during extreme altered states. This symbiotic relationship suggested that the contamination had evolved beyond individual transformation into a collective metamorphosis affecting entire bloodlines simultaneously. Religious institutions struggled to interpret the theological implications of children who claimed direct communication with entities existing beyond traditional concepts of divine hierarchy. Fourth iteration individuals described reality as layered infinitely, with countless versions of every person, place, and event existing simultaneously across dimensional barriers. They spoke of visiting alternate versions of their families, observing historical events that had unfolded differently, and learning from civilizations that had developed along entirely different evolutionary paths. Their casual references to these experiences challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence, identity, and consciousness itself. Government agencies, having abandoned containment efforts years earlier, shifted to documentation and analysis protocols. Researchers discovered that fourth iteration children possess the ability to manipulate quantum probability at the molecular level, effectively rewriting local reality within limited ranges. They could alter the properties of matter, accelerate or reverse time within small areas, and create temporary pocket dimensions where different physical laws operated. These abilities appeared to be unconsciously controlled manifesting most dramatically during emotional states or when the children encountered situations that triggered their protective instincts. The economic implications proved equally revolutionary. Fourth iteration. Children demonstrated intuitive understanding of market fluctuations by observing economic patterns across parallel timelines where events had unfolded differently. Several families discovered their children providing investment advice based on knowledge of how similar situations had resolved in alternate realities. This multidimensional economic awareness created unprecedented advantages for those willing to act on the children's guidance, leading to the emergence of what economists termed probability-based markets, where investment decisions were guided by observation of parallel dimensional outcomes. Technology began evolving in response to fourth iteration influence. Children would instinctively modify electronic devices, creating configurations that shouldn't function according to known engineering principles, but nonetheless produced effects that surpassed the original design specifications. Computers touched by fourth iteration individuals began processing information at rates that exceeded their hardware capabilities, displaying data that appeared to originate from advanced civilizations existing in parallel timelines. These technological modifications suggested that the children served as conduits for knowledge transfer between dimensional layers, unconsciously upgrading human technology through exposure to more advanced parallel versions. Military applications became inevitable as governments recognized the strategic implications of soldiers who could perceive enemy movements across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. Fourth iteration children demonstrated the ability to predict attack patterns by observing how similar conflicts had unfolded in parallel realities, providing tactical advantages that rendered conventional military doctrine obsolete. However, these children also exhibited strong pacifist tendencies, appearing to understand the multidimensional consequences of violence in ways that made them reluctant participants in any form of conflict. Educational researchers noted that fourth iteration children learned through what they termed dimensional osmosis, absorbing knowledge directly from parallel versions of themselves who had acquired different skills and experiences. A child struggling with mathematics in our reality could suddenly demonstrate advanced calculus abilities after what appeared to be a brief period of intense concentration, during which they claimed to have consulted with a parallel version of themselves who had focused more heavily on mathematical studies. This learning method made traditional educational assessment impossible, as the children's knowledge base could expand exponentially between testing sessions. The children's artistic expressions revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspects of their multidimensional awareness. Their drawings, musical compositions, and written works incorporated elements that human consciousness couldn't fully process, creating art that seemed to exist partially in our dimensional layer and partially elsewhere. Viewers of fourth iteration artwork reported experiencing temporary consciousness expansion, briefly perceiving reality through multidimensional awareness, before returning to normal perception with fragmented memories of impossible geometric spaces and entities existing beyond human comprehension. Medical professionals discovered that fourth iteration children possessed immune systems that functioned across dimensional layers, providing protection against diseases that existed in parallel realities but had not yet manifested in our timeline. Blood tests revealed cellular structures that incorporated elements from multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, creating biological systems that operated according to principles beyond current medical understanding. These children appeared to be developing into something that could survive and thrive in multidimensional environments where ordinary humans would cease to exist. Communication between fourth iteration children occurred through methods that bypassed traditional sensory channels entirely. They would coordinate activities across vast distances without any apparent means of contact, suggesting they shared access to communication networks that existed outside our dimensional layer. Parents reported discovering their children engaged in complex collaborative projects with other fourth iteration individuals they had never met, working together on constructions that served purposes the children couldn't or wouldn't explain to adults whose perception remained limited to single-dimensional awareness. As the fourth iteration population reached critical mass in 2023, observers noted the emergence of what researchers termed collective projects, massive undertakings that required coordination between hundreds of fourth iteration children across multiple continents. These projects involved the construction of geometric configurations on a global scale, with each child contributing specific components that formed parts of larger patterns visible only from orbital photography. The purpose of these constructions remained unclear, but their completion coincided with measurable changes in electromagnetic fields, gravitational constants, and quantum fluctuation patterns across affected regions. The distinction between human and post-human had become meaningless. Fourth iteration children represented the culmination of a transformation that began with the Collins family's original bargains and had evolved through generations of supernatural contamination into something entirely beyond human categorization. They existed simultaneously across multiple realities, possessed knowledge from parallel civilizations, and demonstrated abilities that operated according to principles that transcended the physical laws governing ordinary human existence. What had begun as isolated supernatural incidents in Appalachian hollows had become a species-wide evolutionary leap into multidimensional existence. The fourth iteration children were not the end result of this transformation, but rather the beginning of humanity's emergence as a truly multidimensional species, capable of conscious existence across infinite parallel realities. The Collins contamination had achieved its ultimate purpose, serving as the catalyst for humanity's transition from single-dimensional biological organisms into something far more complex and far more capable of surviving in a universe where the boundaries between possible and impossible had permanently dissolved. The old world, where humans existed in ignorance of parallel realities and supernatural forces, had ended not with catastrophe, but with transcendence. The fourth iteration represented humanity's graduation into a form of existence where consciousness itself became the primary tool for navigating infinite layers of reality, where knowledge could be acquired from parallel versions of oneself, and where the very concept of limitation had become obsolete. So there you have it, the twisted legacy of the Collins family and their dark covenant with forces beyond our understanding. From the blood-soaked mine shafts to the cursed timber from the healing touch that demanded terrible payment to the coal dynasty built on otherworldly bargains, and finally to the haunting melodies that came at the cost of their very souls. These 5 bloodlines discovered that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, every gift comes with a price, and every bargain leaves a mark that echoes through generations. The mountains still whisper their names, and somewhere in those ancient peaks, the debt collectors are still waiting,